Aliens ignored every warning about humanity. Their homeworld was reduced to ash in minutes. The first warning was delivered politely. This was important to establish later, when the histories were written, and the arguments began about culpability and proportionality, and the cold mathematics of what had been done and why. The first warning was delivered politely, in the Vithrani language, by a human diplomatic envoy named Counselor Petra Vasquez, who had spent 11 years learning to speak Vithrani without an accent, and who delivered the message in person, standing in the hall of the Supreme Congregation on the Vithrani homeworld of Keth Salar, before an audience of 43 high speakers who represented the full governing authority of the Vithrani Dominion. The message was simple. The Vithrani Dominion had, over the preceding 18 months, conducted systematic raids on 7 human colony worlds in the outer expansion zone. These raids had resulted in the deaths of 9,412 human civilians, the destruction of infrastructure valued at roughly 40 years of colonial development, and the displacement of approximately 200,000 people from their homes. Earth had documented each incident. Earth had presented that documentation to the Galactic Mediation Authority. Earth had requested formal censure proceedings. Earth had, through 4 separate diplomatic channels, communicated its expectation that the raids would cease and that the Vithrani Dominion would enter good faith negotiations regarding reparations. The raids had continued. Counselor Vasquez stood in the hall of the Supreme Congregation and delivered Earth's formal ultimatum. Cease all hostile action against human civilians within 30 days, commit to reparations negotiations, and surrender the commanders responsible for the attacks for independent tribunal proceedings, or face a military response from Earth that would be, she said, in the careful language her briefing documents had prepared for her, proportionate to the harm caused and sufficient to ensure it was not repeated. The 43 high speakers of the Vithrani Dominion listened to this. They conferred among themselves briefly, in the rapid tonal language they used for internal deliberation that Vasquez could follow but was not expected to follow, and then their first speaker, an ancient robed figure named Harath Sovan, who had governed the Dominion for 60 years, and who had in those 60 years absorbed 3 smaller civilizations and repelled 2 attempted invasions, looked at Counselor Vasquez with the specific expression that Vasquez had learned in 11 years of study. To recognize as Vithrani contempt. Humanity, Harath Sovan said, controls 11 star systems. The Vithrani Dominion controls 83. Your military forces number, by our assessment, fewer than 1,200 active warships. Ours number 7,000. You have been a spacefaring civilization for 91 years. We have been a spacefaring civilization for 900. He paused. You have come here to deliver a warning to us. Yes, Vasquez said. We have heard your warning, Harath Sovan said. He made a gesture with his upper left hand that, in Vithrani culture, indicated formal closure of a conversation, the equivalent of hanging up a phone. You may leave now. Vasquez looked at him for a moment. She thought about saying something further. She thought about the follow-up language her briefing documents contained, the escalation points, the additional diplomatic leverage she had been given to deploy if the initial message was not received well. She thought about 11 years of language study and cultural immersion, and the deep, genuine belief she had brought to this work that communication, given sufficient patience and skill, could bridge almost any gap between thinking beings. She thought about 9,412 people. She left. The second warning was delivered less politely. It came 14 days after Vasquez's return to Earth, after the full documentation of her meeting had been reviewed by the UESC Strategic Command, the Earth Council, and the Joint Military Diplomatic Review Panel that had been convened specifically to assess the Vithrani situation. The review panel included 4 former ambassadors, 7 military commanders of various ranks, 2 historians specializing in first contact conflict escalation, and one person whose specific role and qualifications were listed in the official record simply as Strategic Assessment, which was the kind of title that told experienced readers everything they needed to know about what that person actually did. The panel reviewed the documentation. They reviewed the raid records. They reviewed the casualty counts. They reviewed the intelligence assessments of V-Thrani military capability, V-Thrani political structure, V-Thrani decision-making history, and V-Thrani responses to external pressure across 900 years of recorded interstellar history. They reviewed, specifically, the pattern of V-Thrani responses to warnings from civilizations they had assessed as militarily inferior. The pattern was consistent. The second warning was transmitted via quantum relay directly to the V-Thrani Supreme Congregation on Keth Solar. It was brief. It stated that Earth noted the Dominion's failure to respond to the first ultimatum and was extending the deadline by 16 days to a total of 30 days from the date of this second transmission, as a final opportunity for the Dominion to enter compliance. It stated that Earth took the deaths of its civilians with absolute seriousness and would not normalize or accept them. It stated that if compliance was not received by the deadline, Earth would respond. It did not specify how Earth would respond, because there was a school of thought in UESC Strategic Command that specificity in ultimatums was sometimes counterproductive, that a civilization which knew exactly what was coming could calculate whether the cost was acceptable, but a civilization that didn't know had to account for the full range of possibilities, and the full range of possibilities, when dealing with a species that had surprised everyone this badly this many times, was a very wide range. The second warning was received. The V-Thrani response, transmitted 4 days later, was a document of some length that described, in precise legal and diplomatic language, the Dominion's position that the human colonies in question had been established in violation of prior V-Thrani territorial claims, and that the raids were therefore a legitimate act of territorial enforcement rather than an act of aggression. The document was well written. It had clearly been prepared by experienced legal minds. It cited 900 years of interstellar territorial precedent. It was, in the assessment of every human diplomat and lawyer who read it, completely wrong on the facts. The territorial claims it cited had been formally extinguished 40 years ago under the Outer Reach Boundary Agreement, which the V-Thrani Dominion had itself signed. But the Dominion had signed it under a different government, and the current congregation's position was that the agreement had not been properly ratified under V-Thrani constitutional law, a position that was legally creative to a degree that other spacefaring civilizations were watching with varying combinations of alarm and fascination. The raids continued. 3 more colony worlds hit in the following 12 days, 409 more deaths. A settlement called New Cartagena, population 11,000, was burned from orbit so completely that the geological survey drones sent to assess damage found nothing above foundation depth. New Cartagena had been founded 22 years ago by families from 3 different continents of Earth who had pooled their resources and their lives to build something new at the edge of known space. Its oldest building had been a school. The school had been 6 days away from completing its 3rd wing when the V-Thrani ships came over the horizon. The review panel submitted its final recommendation on the evening of the 16th day after the second warning. The recommendation was unanimous. The person who carried the 3rd warning was not a diplomat. Colonel Emeka Diallo of the UESC First Strike Group was not a diplomat and had never wanted to be one, and understood clearly why he had been chosen to deliver this particular message rather than someone from the diplomatic corps. His rank was colonel. His command was the First Strike Group, which was the designation given to the operational unit built around the UESC warship Unbroken Promise and its 6 escort vessels. His orders, delivered by Admiral Chen Yifan personally, were precise and unambiguous, in the way that orders in the UESC tended to be, when the people writing them had thought very carefully about every word. He transmitted the third warning to the Vithrani Supreme Congregation from a position 12 light-minutes outside the Keth solar system. The third warning was very short. This is Colonel Emeka Diallo of the United Earth Space Command. The 30-day deadline issued by Earth has expired without compliance. Earth is now in active enforcement posture. The Vithrani Dominion has one final opportunity to stand down hostile action against human civilians and surrender the responsible commanders to independent tribunal. This opportunity expires in 6 hours. If compliance is not received within 6 hours, Earth will take direct action. Colonel Diallo out. He sent it and then he waited, because that was what the order said to do, and because despite everything he genuinely hoped it would be enough. The Vithrani Supreme Congregation received the transmission. They convened an emergency session. The session lasted 3 hours and 20 minutes, and the records of that session, obtained much later, after everything was over, through means that the UESC Intelligence Division did not discuss publicly, showed that the deliberation had been more fractured than the eventual response suggested. 8 of the 43 high speakers had advocated for entering compliance negotiations. 12 had advocated for a measured military response, a show of force at the system's outer boundary, demonstrating Vithrani fleet strength without direct engagement. 23 had advocated for what First Speaker Harath Sovan ultimately endorsed, which was the position that humanity's ultimatums were a performance for domestic and interstellar political consumption, and that the Dominion's correct response was to ignore them, continue operations, and allow the inherent military disparity between 11 human systems and 83 Vithrani ones to speak for itself. Harath Sovan had been governing for 60 years. He had absorbed 3 civilizations. He had repelled 2 invasions. He had built the Vithrani Dominion from 49 systems to 83 systems through a combination of military force and political will, and he had done it by understanding, with the clarity that came from long experience, that in interstellar politics, the thing that mattered above all others was the willingness to be the larger entity in the room. He had reviewed Earth's military capacity. He had reviewed the specifications of their warships, their fleet numbers, their training records, their engagement history. He had reviewed their record in minor border skirmishes with neighboring civilizations. He had, through intelligence channels that were very good but not, as it turned out, quite good enough, assessed Earth's strategic capabilities. He had concluded that humanity was not a civilization the Vithrani Dominion needed to take seriously. He had reached this conclusion because he was working from complete intelligence. He was working from complete intelligence because the things he didn't know about Earth's military capability were the things Earth had made certain no one knew, and the reason Earth had made certain no one knew them was precisely for a moment like this one. The Vithrani response to the third warning was transmitted back to Colonel Diallo's position 3 hours and 52 minutes after the warning had been sent. It was a single sentence, and it had been written by someone who understood human language well enough to know how to be insulting in it. "We do not negotiate with children who have borrowed their parents' weapons," the message read. "Return to your 11 systems and do not contact the congregation again." Colonel Diallo read the message. He sat with it for a moment. He thought about New Cartagena. He had read the full casualty report. He had read the geological survey. He had looked at the images from the survey drones, the flat, burned plains where a town had been, the foundation outlines of buildings visible in the scan data like shadows of things that no longer existed, the half-completed school wing that was now just a geometric pattern in scorched earth. He thought about 9,821 people. That was the current total, including the deaths from the raids in the extension period. He thought about the order from Admiral Chen, which was clear, and which he had reviewed enough times to know by heart. He opened his command channel. "All units," he said, "advance to Keth Solar System. Execute Operation Reckoning as briefed. Authorization Dial 077 Prime." The Vithrani Dominion maintained a substantial defensive fleet presence around Keth Solar. This was standard practice for any homeworld of a major power. The core system was always the most heavily defended, ringed with orbital installations, fixed weapon emplacements, layered sensor networks, and a standing fleet of sufficient size to deter any realistic threat. The standing fleet in the Keth Solar System on the day Operation Reckoning began comprised 640 warships. This was not a small number. By most relevant benchmarks, it was a very large number. The entire fleet presence of the Rimward Alliance, which was considered a mid-tier military power, was 412 warships. The standing homeworld defense fleet of the Muthari Collective, which had spent 3 centuries building what was widely considered the most formidable fixed-point defense network in known space, was 800. 640 warships in a single system was a statement of serious military commitment. The unbroken promise came out of fold jump at the system's inner boundary, inside the defensive perimeter, not outside it, at 3:40 local station time, when the crew rotation schedules of the Vithrani Defense Fleet placed the maximum number of personnel in rest or transition status. It was alone. The 6 escort vessels had gone elsewhere. They had their own assignments, laid out in the operational plan that the UESC Strategic Command had spent 8 months building, and that Dialo had spent 3 weeks reviewing, and their assignments were important, but they were not here. Here, inside the ring of 640 warships and the orbital installations and the fixed emplacements and the layered sensor networks of the Vithrani homeworld defense, there was one ship. The unbroken promise was not the relentless dawn. It was not the first of its class, and it was not 5 kilometers long, and it was not the ship that had become, in certain circles, something approaching legend in the years since the peripheral Accord crisis. It was smaller than the relentless dawn by a meaningful margin, 3.2 kilometers, and it was older, the second-generation sovereign-class vessel rather than the original, and everything that had been learned from the relentless dawn had been applied to it with the accumulated wisdom of additional years of engineering and operational experience, which meant it was in nearly every functional category more capable than its predecessor. The Vithrani sensor network detected it instantly. They were very good sensors. They correctly identified the fold jump signature as human and correctly assessed the vessel as a sovereign-class warship based on the drive signature and hull return data, and the detection went immediately to the Homeworld Defense Commander, Admiral Sarath Kavan, who had been awake and at his command station, unlike most of his fleet, because he had taken the 6-hour warning seriously in a way that Harath Sovan had not, and who looked at the data and felt, for the first time in his 30-year career, genuinely afraid. Not because of the numbers, because of where the ship had come out. Standard military doctrine for any attacking force was to transit into a system at the outer boundary, the fold entry point that maximized distance from defensive concentrations, allowed time to assess the tactical situation, and kept the attacking force outside the heaviest weapons range while it organized. Every attacking fleet in history had done this because it was correct doctrine. The unbroken promise had appeared inside the defensive ring, inside the orbital installations, inside the weapon emplacements. It had fold jumped directly into the interior of the most heavily defended point in the Vithrani Dominion with the precision of something that had done this before, or had practiced doing this before, or had a fold jump navigation system so accurate that the concept of safe emergence distance simply didn't apply to it. Kavan looked at where the ship had appeared and he understood, in the deeply visceral way that experienced commanders understand things, that the tactical situation was not what he had been told it would be. He began issuing orders. He was very good at his job, and his orders were the right orders, and his people executed them quickly. The 640 warships of the Homeworld Defense Fleet began their combat maneuvers. The orbital installations powered weapons to active charge. The fixed emplacements acquired targeting solutions. Colonel Diallo opened a channel to the Vithrani Homeworld Defense Command frequency. "Admiral Kavan," he said, "my name is Colonel Emeka Diallo of the United Earth Space Command. I want to be honest with you about what's happening. My orders are to carry out a specific military objective against Keth Salar. I am going to carry out those orders. I am going to do this regardless of what your fleet does, and I want you to understand that clearly." A pause. "But I am not here to kill your people. I am not here to destroy your civilization. Earth has no interest in conquest and no interest in casualties beyond what the mission requires. What happens to your fleet in the next 30 minutes depends entirely on whether your fleet engages mine." He released the channel. Kavan received the transmission. He looked at the tactical display showing one human warship at the center of his defensive formation. He had 640 ships. He had orbital installations. He had fixed emplacements. He had, on paper, every advantage that existed in military calculation. He gave the order to hold. Not to stand down. Not to lower weapons. To hold to maintain readiness without opening fire for 60 seconds, while he made a decision that he understood with complete clarity was the most consequential decision of his life. He used 50 of those 60 seconds to transmit an emergency message to the Supreme Congregation that said, in the plainest language he could construct, "The human ship is inside our defensive perimeter, and I need to know if you have information about their capabilities that I have not been given, because what I am looking at does not match what I was told to expect." The response took 40 seconds to arrive. It was from Harath Sovan personally, and it said, "Our intelligence assessment is complete and reliable. Proceed with defensive engagement. One human vessel cannot threaten this system." Kavan read this. He thought about where the ship had emerged. He thought about the precision required to fold jump to that exact position. He thought about 30 years of military experience and the specific instinct that experience creates, the pattern recognition that operates below the level of conscious analysis, and that had, in his career, saved his life twice. He gave the order to engage. 640 warships opened fire simultaneously. What happened in the next 11 minutes was documented in extraordinary detail, because the Vithrani Defense Fleet had excellent recording systems, and because the Galactic Mediation Authority later conducted a formal inquiry that gathered every available piece of data from every available source and compiled it into a record that was reviewed, studied, argued over, and eventually archived as one of the most significant documents in the modern history of interstellar warfare. The record showed the following. The Unbroken Promise absorbed the initial simultaneous broadside of 640 warships without movement, without visible damage, and without returning fire. The energy yield of that broadside, calculated from weapons discharge data, was sufficient, by established military engineering standards, to destroy a small moon. The Unbroken Promise's hull reported no structural compromise. 11 seconds after the initial broadside, the Unbroken Promise activated its primary weapons array, the Cascade Array, which the Relentless Dawn had used to considerable effect in the Peripheral Accord crisis, and which had, in the years since, undergone 3 generations of development and refinement. On the Unbroken Promise was not the same system that had impressed the Galactic Senate. It was the 4th generation of that system. It had expanded from 48 simultaneous targeting solutions to 112. It fired once. One discharge. One coordinated activation of all 112 targeting solutions, each calibrated to minimum destruction yield, enough to disable a vessel, not enough to destroy it, because Diallo's orders and Diallo's own intentions aligned on the point that unnecessary deaths were unnecessary. 112 Vithrani warships went dark simultaneously. Not destroyed. Disabled, drives offline, weapons offline, life support active. 112 ships in 11 seconds, removed from the engagement without a single casualty. The remaining 528 ships held fire. Kavan's voice came on the command channel, and it was the voice of someone who had just processed something that fundamentally revised his understanding of the situation. "Colonel Diallo," he said, "what are your orders?" "My orders," Diallo said, "are to hold your fleet in place while the specific military objective is carried out. The objective does not involve your fleet, Admiral. It does not involve your population centers. It involves a precise list of targets that I am going to read to you now, so that you know exactly what is happening and why." He read the list. The list was not long. It contained the coordinates of 11 specific installations on and around Keth Salar, the Vithrani Supreme Congregation's military command center, the 3 shipyards in the Keth Salar system that had been identified as the construction and staging facilities for the fleet elements responsible for the colony raids, the orbital weapons platform that had provided fire support for the new Cartagena bombardment, the fuel and logistics depot complex that supplied the raid fleet, 2 intelligence facilities whose databases contained, per UESC intelligence assessment, the planning records for every raid conducted against human colonies, and the hall of the Supreme Congregation itself. Kavan was quiet for a moment after the list was read. "The hall," he said. "The congregation is not in session at this hour," Diallo said. "The hall will be empty. We have confirmed this through our own surveillance. We are not targeting people, Admiral. We are targeting the physical and institutional infrastructure that planned and executed the killing of 9,821 human civilians." Another silence. "And first speaker Sovan," Kavan said, "is not on the target list," Diallo said. "He will be required to stand before the Galactic Mediation Authority to answer for what has been done. Alive and answerable is the appropriate outcome for him. We are not executioners." He paused. "We are, however, entirely serious," he said. "I am going to ask you one time to instruct your remaining fleet to hold position while the objective is carried out. If your fleet engages, the outcome will not be favorable. I will not enjoy it, but I will complete the mission." Kavan looked at his tactical display. He looked at 112 disabled ships. He looked at the unbroken promise, sitting motionless at the center of his formation, having absorbed a full simultaneous broadside from 640 warships, and then having disabled 112 of them with a single discharge in 11 seconds. He thought about his 30 years. He thought about Harath Sovan's intelligence assessment, which had been complete and reliable. He transmitted the order to the remaining 528 warships: "Hold position, do not engage." Then he sat in his command chair and watched the display as the Unbroken Promise's secondary weapon systems, or precision strike armaments that were separate from the Cascade Array, designed for surgical targeting rather than fleet engagement, began their work. The 11 targets burned in sequence. Not the planet. The planet was untouched. Its atmosphere, its surface, its cities, its 2.3 billion inhabitants, all untouched. The Unbroken Promise's targeting systems were the most precise instruments of their kind ever built by human hands, and they had been given specific coordinates, and those coordinates were followed with an exactness that the investigators would later confirm, to within 2 meters, matched the target list that Diallo had read to Kavan. The military command center went first. It had been built 200 meters underground, behind shielding that was rated to survive a sustained orbital bombardment. It took 4 seconds. The 3 shipyards went next. They were large structures, the kind of orbital infrastructure that took decades to build and represented a civilization's serious commitment to military capacity. They went dark and cold, their power systems destroyed, their structural integrity compromised, not explosively but thoroughly. The way something is ruined when ruined is the specific intent. The orbital weapons platform, the logistics depot, the intelligence facilities. And last, the Hall of the Supreme Congregation. The hall was the oldest building on Kethsalar, built 1100 years ago in the early period of Vithrani interstellar expansion. It was a landmark and a symbol, and the architectural heart of Vithrani governmental identity. It was empty at this hour, as confirmed. It was also the place where 43 high speakers had listened to Counselor Petra Vasquez deliver a polite warning about 9,000 human civilians, and had then made a gesture with an upper left hand that meant this conversation is over. It went the way the other targets went, not in a flash, not in drama, just structurally, precisely, irretrievably gone. 11 targets, 23 minutes from first strike to last, 0 civilian casualties confirmed. Diallo opened the channel one more time. "Admiral Kavan," he said, "the objective is complete. Earth's forces are withdrawing from the Keth Solar System. We will hold position at the outer boundary while your fleet recovery operations proceed. Our medical and engineering teams are available to assist with the disabled vessels if you want them." A pause. "Earth will be transmitting a formal communication to the Supreme Congregation within the next 12 hours outlining the terms under which the current crisis can be resolved and the conditions for normalization of relations. We would strongly suggest the congregation review this communication carefully." Another pause. "This is not something Earth wanted to do. It is something that was made necessary by decisions that were made in that hall before it was gone. We would very much prefer that whatever comes next does not require us to come back." He released the channel. The unbroken promise moved toward the system boundary at a pace that was, tactically, completely unhurried. The 528 intact Vithrani warships watched it go. Herath Sovan was woken at 4:12 to be told that the hall of the Supreme Congregation was gone. He did not believe it at first. This was understandable. It was a building that had stood for 1100 years. He asked for confirmation and received it. He asked for the fleet status report and received that too. He sat in his residence with the fleet status report and the target assessment and the recording from Admiral Kavan's command systems, showing what the unbroken promise had done to 112 warships in 11 seconds, and he sat with this for a very long time. He had been governing for 60 years. He had absorbed 3 civilizations. He had built 83 systems. He had always understood the world through the clear lens of disparity. Larger is stronger, older is wiser, more is better, and the only thing that mattered in the end was the capacity to be the larger entity in the room. He had reviewed Earth's military capacity. He had reviewed their fleet numbers and their engagement history, and their 11 systems against his 83. He had concluded that humanity was not a civilization the Vithrani Dominion needed to take seriously. He had been working from complete intelligence. He had been working from complete intelligence about everything Earth was willing to be seen having, and nothing about everything else. He looked at the target list. He looked at what had been taken and what had been left. He looked at the precision of it, the specific and deliberate care with which someone had constructed a strike that caused maximum institutional damage and 0 civilian deaths, and he understood, in a way that was new and unwelcome and necessary, that this precision was not a limitation. It was a choice. It was the demonstration, conducted at his expense, of the difference between what Earth was capable of doing and what Earth had decided to do. The communication from Earth arrived at 600 as promised. It was long and detailed and written in the careful language of experienced diplomats who had thought through every implication of every sentence. He read it twice. His senior advisors read it. His military commanders read it. The terms were not punitive in the way that the terms of a civilization exacting revenge would be punitive. They were structured, and they were enforceable, and they were rooted in a framework that was recognizable as law rather than dominance. Reparations, calculated against specific documented losses. Criminal tribunal proceedings for the commanders responsible for the raids, to be conducted by the Galactic Mediation Authority. Withdrawal from the contested territorial claims. A monitoring agreement that would allow independent verification of the Dominion's compliance. And one additional item at the end that was not a demand but a statement. Earth noted that it had no interest in the Vithrani Dominion's destruction or diminishment. Earth had significant interest in the Dominion's constructive participation in the framework of interstellar law that the Galactic Senate was working to build. Earth looked forward, the statement concluded, to a future in which both civilizations were part of that framework, and the events of the preceding months could be addressed, resolved, and eventually regarded as the difficult beginning of a better relationship. Hareth Sovan read this last section 3 times. He thought about 60 years. He thought about 83 systems. He thought about the things he knew and the things he had not known and the difference between those two categories that was now, irrevocably, part of the record. He called his senior advisors to his office, and he told them to begin drafting a formal response accepting the terms. One of his advisors, a young woman named Sareth Val, who had been against the raids from the beginning, and who had said so at the time, and who had the specific quality of being someone who was right often enough that it was uncomfortable, looked at him for a moment. "First speaker," she said carefully, "the 8 who advocated for compliance negotiations at the emergency session." "Yes," he said. "Their position should have been heard." "Yes," he said again. She looked at him. "The intelligence assessment," she said, "was incomplete," he said. "I believed it was complete. That was my error." She considered whether to say the next thing and decided to say it. "How does a civilization build what they built," she said, "without us knowing?" He thought about this. He thought about it carefully because it was a question worth thinking about carefully. "Because they are very good at knowing what they want to be seen having," he said, "and very good at keeping hidden what they don't." He paused. "And because we looked at 11 systems and 91 years and we decided we had seen enough." She was quiet. "We will not make that error again," he said, "not as a threat, as a statement of intent. Begin the response." The formal inquiry conducted by the Galactic Mediation Authority took 14 months and produced a record of 7,000 pages. Its conclusions were studied by every spacefaring civilization in the known galaxy. Some studied it for its legal precedents, some for its military analysis, some for the specific operational data it contained about the unbroken promises capabilities, which were now documented in clinical detail and which produced, in the strategic planning departments of several dozen civilizations, a period of intense reassessment. The Kavari Dominion spent 6 months in private strategic review following the inquiry's publication. They had already entered compliance with the Peripheral Accord 2 years prior, following the original incident with the Relentless Dawn. This second data point refined their calculations considerably. They increased their science and technology investment by 40%, with specific emphasis on materials science and drive systems, and they quietly opened a back-channel diplomatic communication with Earth requesting an exchange of technical attaches. Earth accepted. The Rimward Alliance proposed a mutual defense treaty with Earth within 3 months of the inquiry's publication. The proposal was thoughtful and detailed, and had clearly been worked on for some time, suggesting it had been prepared before the inquiry was complete and possibly before the Keth Salar incident itself. Earth's diplomatic corps received it warmly and entered negotiations. The 42 civilizations that had been watching the Senate proceedings on relay, and which had watched the subsequent inquiry with varying degrees of alarm and fascination, produced a wide range of responses. Several requested formal diplomatic missions. Several quietly reviewed their own treatment of any human colonies or human interests that fell within their spheres of influence. A few drew the conclusion that was most obviously available to any strategist looking at the data, that the appropriate time to have taken humanity seriously was before New Cartagena, and that the appropriate time to take humanity seriously going forward was now, and that the gap between those two moments contained a number of lessons worth internalizing. Counselor Petra Vasquez received the Interstellar Diplomatic Service's highest commendation, awarded in a ceremony that she attended, and at which she gave a short speech that was not in any official record because she declined to have it recorded. The people in the room described it afterward in different ways. Everyone agreed that it was brief and that it said something true. The criminal tribunal for the commanders responsible for the colony raids began 8 months after the inquiry's conclusion. It lasted 6 months and resulted in 7 convictions. Hareth Sovan testified at the tribunal. He was not on trial. The tribunal's mandate was specific to the commanders who had planned and executed the raids. But he testified because he had been asked to and because, in the 61st year of his governance, he had arrived at a place where he believed that testimony was appropriate. His testimony was 3 hours long. He answered every question put to him. He did not attempt to shift responsibility or construct exculpatory narratives. He was asked by the tribunal's chief arbiter, near the end, whether he had any statement he wished to add. He said, "I received 3 warnings. I dismissed all 3. The consequences of that dismissal fell partly on my civilization and partly on people who should never have been harmed. The people who should not have been harmed remain harmed. That is not something I can correct. What I can do is ensure that the institutions of the Vithrani Dominion that planned and supported those raids are replaced by institutions that do not, and I am doing that, and I will continue doing that for however long I remain in this office." He paused. The warnings were clear. I chose not to hear them clearly. That is the truth of it. The arbiter thanked him for his testimony. He returned to Kethsalar. The construction of the new hall of the Supreme Congregation began 2 years after the old one was gone. It was built in a different style, modern rather than ancient, its architects having decided that a replica of the original would be dishonest in a way that a new thing would not be. It was smaller than the original, without the monumental scale that the 1,100-year-old building had accumulated through centuries of additions and expansions. It was well made and functional, and the Vithrani people, by the measures available, seemed to accept it. On the day it opened, a message arrived from Earth's diplomatic mission on Kethsalar. It was brief and formal and appropriate for the occasion, congratulating the Dominion on the completion of the building and expressing Earth's continued interest in the development of a productive relationship. Hareth Sovan read the message and set it on his desk. He thought about 3 warnings. He thought about 11 targets, chosen with precision from a list of possible targets that could have been very much longer. He thought about 9,821 people, and about the flat-burned plain where a school had been building its 3rd wing. He thought about the difference between intelligence that was complete and intelligence that was sufficient, and about how long it had taken him to understand that these were not the same thing. He set down the message and looked out the window at the new hall, clean and plain in the morning light, and he thought that perhaps the most important thing to understand about a civilization that had, in 91 years, done what humanity had done, was not what they could build. It was that they had chosen, with everything available to them, what not to build. That was the thing worth understanding. He thought it would take him the rest of his life to fully understand it. He suspected that was appropriate.